Ceridon 4 orbited its tired blue star like a coin that had been flipped too many times and never landed on mercy. After the war, Captain Darren Vex had chosen it for the same reason broken blades choose drawers. No one asks them to shine. His hangar apartment was a museum of useful neglect. Half-gutted thrusters on sawhorses, a cot that creaked in a dialect of complaint, one steel mug that remembered coffee and gunmetal in equal measure. It was not a place for company. When the silence began to feel like a second, heavier atmosphere, he did the practical thing and posted a notice on the station's civic grid. Maid wanted, hazard pay negotiable, food decent if you don't mind ration stew, discretion required. He pictured a veteran spacer with a mended suit and a low tolerance for dust, or, if he got lucky, a pit bot with enough dignity left to obey a broom. The shuttle from the common carriers hissed open on a Tuesday that had forgotten its own name, and the woman who stepped onto the dock convinced the hangar lights to behave as if they had been designed for her entrance. She wore threadbare travel robes hemmed with ship's twine, a small canvas satchel slung crosswise, and no jewelry save the cool geometry of a mind that had not surrendered. Her skin had the faint opalescent undertone of the Syraxi, a people Darren knew mostly as rumors and headlines, and when she lifted her chin, the station's recycled air came up short against the precision of her posture. "I am Calith," she said, and the accent put an old vowel into his name when he offered it back. He noticed absurd things, that her boots had been resoled by hand, that every piece of her robe had been darned as if by someone who respected cloth, that she did not smell like perfume, only like rain that had decided to be patient. He apologized for the mess as a formality and then actually saw it, the way you only see your own life when you imagine someone else living in it. She did not tut, did not perform sympathy, did not offer the brittle reassurance of guests who plan to leave. Instead, she stood still long enough for dust to confess itself, walked a slow circle as if measuring the hangar's mood, and asked what was broken and what was merely loud. When he answered, with a soldier's catalog rather than a salesman's pitch, she listened without blinking, the way mechanics listen to an engine and lawyers listen to a lie. Terms were proposed: room, wages, whatever privacy can be smuggled into a space with thin walls. Terms were accepted, with a nod that made the agreement feel like an oath sworn to a third party neither of them could see. Darren led her past the grounded Starfury, past the crate that had become a table by force of habit, to the narrow galley whose chief virtue was a kettle that refused to die. "I can start now," Calith said, and he believed her with the uncomplicated faith of a man whose life had just remembered a better verb than endure. Calith began with air and light as if the hangar were a sick room. She opened the high vents and coaxed the fans until their cough became breath. She unlatched the skylight and let the thin star pour down, turning motes into a temporary constellation. Darren, determined not to loom, retreated to his bench and pretended to busy himself with a stripped stabilizer while watching in the distortion of a chrome casing. She did not attack his chaos, she negotiated with it. Tools migrated in families to drawers that suited their tempers. Rags learned to live in a bucket that did not leak. A stubborn stain on the deck discovered that persistence is a two-player game. When she found the shrine he had made without meaning to, a chipped mug, a folded patch, the dog tags he wore only when sleep misbehaved, she neither dusted nor disturbed, only straightened the edge of the cloth in a gesture so small it felt like grammar. They learned each other's dimensions by accident and design. He brewed tea without asking her preference, and set the mug on the workbench where the handle faced her dominant hand. She accepted it a minute later without looking up, as if she had been refusing only the assumption, not the heat. When a microburst somewhere in the station girders made the skylight shudder and the ladder hop, Calith was already halfway up, fingers closing on the bolt that had thought it could escape. Darren anchored the ladder without comment and met her eyes when she glanced down, the tether of that moment steadier than any rope. In the afternoon, a maintenance drone wandered in, drunk on its own wiring, and tried to be helpful by mis-sorting scrap. Calith stepped into its blind spot, murmured a string of corrective codes that sounded like a lullaby taught to machinery, and sent it out again humming as if it had been thanked. He kept discovering what she wasn't, She wasn't timid. The first time the kettle screeched and the fuse popped, she folded the breaker back into reason with a knuckle and a narrowed gaze. She wasn't impressed. When he wiped grease from his hands as if apologizing for having hands at all, she handed him a better rag and said, "You will ruin your skin," with the practical affection of a medic. She wasn't the sort of beautiful that makes rooms stupid, though she could have been, upon request. She was the kind that makes rooms honest. As evening leaned in and the hangar's echoes learned new manners, Darren realized his old injuries had quieted, not from painkillers, but because the place that housed them had put down a softer floor. Later, when the work had left them both clean enough to taste the day, they ate standing at the crate table. Bread the color of adjectives, a tin of sardines that had seen better seas, pears from a hydroponic farmer who liked to barter for spare capacitors. He asked the questions you ask when not interrogating. Where had she come from? Where was she going? Why this job, this station, this tired man with a soldering iron and a habit of waking at 4? She answered with a Xeroxy discipline that measured truth into manageable portions. "I needed a door that opened," she said, glancing at the one she had propped with a brick because the hinge sulked. "And work I could finish each day without lying to myself about what was clean." He swallowed a laugh, not because it would have been rude, but because joy at that volume startled him. Before sleep, they drew lines on the floor with words. "This shelf mine, that locker yours, that corner for things we don't have names for yet." He offered the cot. She declined, with a look at his shoulder and the way his breath caught when he reached too far. The spare pallet near the warm belly of the Starfury would do, until they could afford better. The station's night cycle dimmed the hangar by degrees, until engines looked like sleeping beasts and panels like closed books. Caliph lay down with her back to the room as if daring it to misbehave. Darren turned the kettle to a low purr, because he had learned, suddenly and without ceremony, that some people listen best when the world is making small, steady promises. Outside, Cyrodiil's thin wind traced the hull. Inside, the universe that had delivered a maid to a soldier began, increment by increment, to remember how to be a home. The first hint that peace had an expiration date was the way the bazaar's noise turned brittle, like glass deciding it had been touched too many times. Darren had brought Caliph down for filters and thread. She drifted between stalls as if negotiating with color, and he kept a casual distance that let him watch reflections in brass and the angles of men who had learned to move like problems. 3 of them peeled from the crowd with the economy of professionals, their coats cut to hide shoulder rigs, their faces already arranging themselves into the self-importance of men who have spotted a bounty. One said her name under his breath, and the syllables sounded rehearsed. Another smiled the way hyenas parody courtesy and began to close the angle on the spice vendor's awning where Caliph had paused to smell cardamom. Darren stepped into their path before his training could make the choice for him, all quiet posture and the kind of stillness that reminds a room it has mass. "Wrong dock," he told them. And when the first reached for a weapon, Darren let the old war come up through his bones and made a precise, ugly lesson out of the man's wrist. The awning collapsed in saffron and curses, a blaster hissed, a stall of cheap holos shattered into neon rain, and Caliph, who had been a maid an hour ago and something else much longer, moved through the sudden weather like a narrow gust, a twist of her body sending a second attacker into a stack of oxygen canisters that very wisely chose not to explode. They ran, not with panic, but with timing, Darren setting a pace that kept their pursuers a corridor behind and turned every corner into an argument the other men lost by half a step. Caliph grabbed a passerby's fallen parcel and tossed it back without looking because kindness done at speed still counts. Darren palmed a maintenance panel he had absolutely never been authorized to open and shoved them into a service duct that smelled like hot dust and old engineering. The hunters split their forces. One tried to get clever on the catwalk, a silhouette with a rifle and a plan that involved gravity, and Darren punished the idea by kicking the bolted ladder until it forgot to behave, sending the man into an inelegant bounce that made the catwalk rattle its opinion. 2 more cut them off by the waste exchanger, confidence sharpened by numbers, and Caliph stepped forward with empty hands and a tone no one had ever used on her, and lived. "Go home," she said, and then proved she meant it by flicking her wrist and losing a sling stone she had palmed from the spice stall, the little gray pebble striking a visor dead center, with a sound like a bell deciding which church it belonged to. Darren finished the conversation with a knee, an elbow, and the kind of shove that persuades a man to learn a new job, then dragged Caliph toward a freight lift while alarms started to practice being convincing. The lift's door stuck the way old doors do when they are waiting for a story. Darren pried and swore softly, and Caliph laid 3 fingers against the seam, whispering a string of Siroxy syllables that sounded like mathematics trying to be a lullaby, and the lock rethought its outlook. They dropped 6 levels in a thunder of chain and bad decisions, and the car stopped with a lurch that would have put lesser knees on the floor. Caliph's breath went ragged, and she wrapped her arms around herself as if bracing for hands that were not there. Darren didn't reach for her because touch can be theft. He set his back against the gate, listened for the pace of boots above, and said, conversational as a man discussing weather, "I've got you," which is not a promise soldiers make lightly. The gate shuddered, the shaft above them filled with the sound of a rifle bolt racking with enthusiasm. Darren ripped the car's hatch and shoved Caliph into the crawl space, then followed with the graceless speed of someone who has decided to keep breathing out of spite. When they burst into the hangar minutes later, both of them tasting copper and laughter that hadn't worked up the nerve to exist yet, the Kestrel looked like a door that had been waiting its whole life to be flung open. Darren slammed the ramp, burned out of the bay, and threaded the traffic with a geometry that made the station's control tower whisper new swear words into its headsets. Only when the vectors steadied and Ceridon 4's thin atmosphere stopped trying to decide whether it loved them, did Darren look over and see Caliph shaking. Not from exertion, but from the past catching up to her at an inconvenient hour. He put the Kestrel on autopilot, flipped the safety on the gun he hated owning, and sat down on the deck in front of her, so that if she looked anywhere but the floor, she would have to see a man whose hands were currently empty. "You shouldn't have done that," she managed, and he recognized the sentence as a talisman people carry when they have seen too many rescues end in deaths. "I post job adverts," he said, "because humor has saved more lives than any other field dressing, and I over-deliver on customer service." Her laugh came out like a cough and then corrected itself. She pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth until her shoulders found their correct width again. Outside, the station rolled away, suddenly less interested in being their problem. Inside, the kettle decided now would be a marvelous time to boil. Back in the hangar, the day walked off its adrenaline and left behind the dignified ache of bodies that had been asked to improvise. Darren cleaned the graze on his arm with the practiced meanness of a medic who has stopped negotiating with infection, then passed the bottle to Caliph without comment. She dabbed antiseptic along a ribbon of skin revealed where her sleeve had torn, jaw tight, eyes elsewhere. "They knew you," he said finally, not cornering her with the question, just laying it on the table between the mugs and the stray bolts like another thing that needed sorting. She stared at the rag until it remembered it was supposed to be useful, then folded it once, twice, aligning edges that had never agreed with each other. "Siroxy have long memories," she said, voice thin as wire, "and longer appetites. I was born where rooms learned to bow. Crown daughter, if anyone is still keeping that ledger. And when our palace moons fell, the men who caught us with soft hands offered safety in the shape of a cage." Darren did not say he was sorry, because sorrow is a coin the world counterfeits. He said, "Understood," and reached for the kettle because boiling water is the oldest prayer. She told him about doors that only opened inward, about tutors who measured obedience like oxygen, about a ceremony she was meant to survive with gratitude, and how she had declined by leaving a knife in the floor between 2 feet that had expected her to kneel. He told her about orders read from a tablet with names in a column, and how the names turned into weights he kept in his pockets. He told her about a lieutenant who loved the word acceptable, And the day Darren decided to live somewhere that didn't. When she finished, she laughed a small, mean laugh at herself and said, "So I answered a cleaning job with a false name and less than honest intent." And he waved the sentence away with the hand that wasn't holding a mug. "You answered a door that opened," he said. "I posted it." They reviewed the station's rumor systems like two burglars planning an alibi. Darren called in favors with the dockmaster who collected rare coins and owed the Kestrel a berth. Kalith rewrote her work history using the precise lies of survival, converting a palace education into vacuum-rated housekeeping, and can negotiate with fuses. He installed a thermal decoy in the wall behind the shrine he never spoke of, so an impatient scan would read 2 hearts when there was 1. And she adjusted the Kestrel's transponder to a serial number that had fallen off a list during a bureaucrat's lunch. Every now and then, she went quiet, and her hands forgot they were capable. He filled the silence with practicalities: gasket sizes, coil tolerances, the station's grumpiest lift, until the room remembered conversation did not have to be a courtroom. When the sun slid behind debris and Cyrodiil's light went the color of chrome, he found her beneath the skylight with her spine to a beam, eyes on the narrow strip of sky, breathing like someone teaching a machine a better rhythm. "Why did you step between me and men who meant to make me a story?" she asked without looking down. Darren considered lying in the helpful ways, saying it was impulse or training or that he had seen the angle and couldn't bear a sloppy ambush, and decided none of it would earn the room's respect. "Because the first rule they teach you is to stand where the harm is going to try," he said simply. "And I didn't unlearn the only part worth keeping." She slid down the beam until she was sitting in the spill of light. When he sat across from her, boots touching, the air felt less like a schedule and more like a place. "There is a Syroxy word," she offered, "for the feeling you get when someone stands with you before you have asked and stays when you don't know how to." She spoke it, a soft complexity of consonants that made the hanger sound suddenly older. He repeated it sloppily, and she corrected his mouth with 2 fingers, quick and clinical, the smallest intimacy either of them had permitted in years. He built her a door that night, not out of romance, but because he had finally repaired enough of himself to promise hinges. The pallet by the Starfury became a room writ small. A curtain that actually curtained, a shelf for the neatness she had brought with her, a hook for a robe that stooped under the weight of too much travel. She watched him measure twice and cut once, watched him sand edges that would catch on fabric and tempers, watched him hang the curtain as if it were a standard on a field where the men had decided to lay their rifles down. When he finished, he stepped back to let her walk through first. She did, and on the other side she turned and touched her forehead to his sternum, in the Syroxy sign of deepest trust, a gesture he had only read in briefs written by men who did not understand what it cost to perform. His hands hovered, and then, slow, visible, rested on her shoulders the way you place tools on a bench you have polished for another's use. Sleep came late, but it was the right kind. Cyrodiil 4 spun, the skylight showed a strip of star salt, the kettle clicked to quiet. Darren lay on the cot listening to the building make old man noises and counted out of an antique superstition the number of doors he could open from where he was lying. The galley, the finger, the curtain, the escape hatch he had oiled last week because he had started hoping to use it less. Beyond the curtain, Kalith breathed in an even measure that made the engines jealous. The station's comm grid murmured idle nonsense, the sort of chatter that had tried to kill them at noon and now sounded like weather. He closed his eyes on the image of saffron in the air and a ring of men learning to call themselves ex-hunters, and promised the room, quietly, because vows made loudly tend to put on armor, that tomorrow he would buy better hinges, a stronger bolt, and a plant that would decide to live here because someone finally asked it to. Darren discovered that love, like shipwriting, begins with the unglamorous math of load and hinge, so he started there, reinforcing the mezzanine with salvaged struts, planning splinters from a door jamb, and setting a brass bolt that clicked shut with the authority of a vow. Kalith answered with light, warm filaments strung beneath the skylight, a narrow strip of sun-catching foil that made the afternoon pour itself politely into the room, 2 pots of hardy station ferns that tolerated recycled air and learned the schedule of the kettle by sound. Word drifted across Ciridon 4 that the human in Bay J6 was building a home instead of a bunker. And the station sent offerings the way a village does when it has decided to be kind. Bread from a hydroponic grower, second-hand linens that smelled like soap instead of stamps, a dented music box that played a Siroxy lullaby with 3 wrong notes and 1 perfect memory. He cut a ring from scrap hull and threaded it with copper he'd braided himself. Then took Caliph to ring 12, where the sky sits closer than sense, and asked the question without speeches. Hands open, helmet under his arm, old scars visible because some proof matters. She said yes with a laugh that unlatched the years she had kept behind her teeth and pressed her forehead to his chest in the oldest Siroxy promise a person can give. They married in the engine room with the dockmaster witnessing on his bent clipboard and the Kestrel's AI officiating in a voice patched from ship's logs and lullabies. The lights dimming at exactly the wrong time, so that their kiss happened in the kind of darkness that belongs to the brave. The station tried to interrupt with a magistrate and 2 armored officers bearing a warrant dressed in the grammar of property, but Darren keyed 3 maintenance drones into a stolid wall. Caliph greeted the men with the sovereign disdain of a woman whose last cage had been paid for and burned, and the dockmaster quietly unplugged a relay that made the warrant forget its lines. When the intruders left, with their dignity folded under their arms, the wedding resumed, as if ceremony had always included the mandatory removal of nonsense. They built a routine worth defending. Darren woke early to pry the grit out of turbine teeth and to make tea that never boiled over, because he finally listened for the note just before the scream. Caliph returned the market's gaze with the courtesy owed to instruments and none of the courtesy owed to men who loved her name too much, buying spices by scent and thread by thumb. He taught her torque, she taught him patience, and between the 2 of them, the Kestrel stopped sounding like an apology and started sounding like a promise. Even the kettle accepted the new order and clicked obedient at the touch of her knuckle. Some nights they danced barefoot on the hangar floor for the foolish joy of it, his hand steady at her waist, her smile a quiet rebellion against the ledger that had once itemized her usefulness. Other nights they fell asleep in clothes that smelled of solvent and cardamom. The door bolted, the skylight opened to a ribbon of indifferent stars that no longer felt like a jury. Rumor upgraded itself to legend. Vex guarding a Siroxy crown daughter who swears she's a maid, the maid who fixed the air recycler by humming to it, the pair who turned a hangar into a hearth. And while Darren insisted he was still only a man who posted a job advert and got lucky, he caught himself polishing the 5-credit coin he'd bolted to the bulkhead and calling it their first investment. When he forgot to doubt the future, he found Caliph already living in it. A shelf labeled in 2 languages, a folded list of parts for the nursery of plants she meant to coax from the stubborn gloom, a sketch, careful hopeful, of the bay as it would look with a second cot that neither of them would pretend was temporary. It turned out that marriage on Ciridon doesn't end in a kiss so much as begin in a broadcast. The Science Directorate mailed an invitation wrapped in courtesy and bait, asking the Siroxy domestic to participate in a longitudinal study on resilience, which was a lovely word that meant cage if you said it with a budget. Darren met the courier in the hangar with grease on his knuckles and laws in his mouth, offered the man a stool and a bad cup of coffee, and traded the study for something measurable. Station statutes that outlawed callers in any form, penalties that indexed to an offender's net worth instead of a victim's patience, a clause that allowed dock workers to ignore warrants that tried to rename a person. Caliph stood behind him silent and bright as a blade, and when the courier left with a jar of orchard jam and a draft bill he promised to read twice, she slid her fingers into the back pocket of Darren's coveralls and pulled him close as if theft and thanks were cousins. The threat that followed wore the same old uniform as every century's worst idea. 3 cutters with false rescue colors cycling the docks at shift change, a tinny announcement about health inspections, a nods and smiles detail of men who had trained their hands to look gentle before they closed. Darren swung the kestrel sideways, like a door that had learned to stand in the way, and told the kids from the hydroponics crew to run the drill he'd made them practice until they hated him. Caliph met the boarding team at the threshold with empty hands and the kind of diplomacy that leaves bruises on pride rather than faces. She let the leader read every syllable of his warrant aloud into the quiet she owned, corrected his pronunciation of her name with a courtesy that was pure insult, and then stepped aside so Darren could show the man the 5-credit coin, bolt shiny and patient, while he explained in a soft voice how much policy it represented now. The cutters lost interest exactly as fast as the crowd gained it, and retreat felt like relief even to the men who had not been raised to notice the difference. Afterward, the dock rang with a small cheer that embarrassed them both. The kind citizens make when they see something repaired that they thought would always rattle. Life didn't become gentle, but it learned not to be cruel without consequence. The hangar filled with the noises of a home that insists on being heard. Pans arguing with heat, the hiss of a shower that finally learned constant pressure, the whisper of Caliph's prayer strings as she tuned them while checking the closure on the bolts. The kestrel's logs grew a new column labeled Doors Opened, and Darren found excuses to read those numbers twice on bad days. They took in a stray from the repair fields, a boy too old for apprenticeship and too young to drink away a war, teaching him which brushes forgive mistakes and which sockets lie, and he left them a note in shaky block letters that said thanks for the room, where no one shouted before he shipped off to pilot school with a spine that held itself up. Evenings they'd sit under the skylight and divide the galaxy into 2 piles, work and joy, and then mess up their own categories by finding joy in work and making a job of joy. Sometimes she would touch her forehead to his sternum and say the Syroxy word for the feeling of being stood with, instead of stood over, and he would repeat it clumsily until it sounded better inside his mouth than in the air. When Darren finally asked if she missed palaces, Caliph laughed like a breach in a dam and said she preferred valves that took persuasion over courtiers that did not, then kissed the grease by his ear because the day had earned it. And on mornings when the light came in right and the ferns shook off station dust like small green animals, he'd catch the reflection of a man who had posted a job advert for a maid and been hired by his own better life. And he'd marvel, briefly and without apology, that 5 credits had purchased the one thing war forgot to teach him how to keep.